Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Courtney Forehand. I am the Colorado Municipal League Training and Marketing Specialist. Today we are going to be joined by a few people who will actually be introduced in a few minutes, but I wanted to do some housekeeping notes for everyone. So thank you for joining us for today's webinar. It is being recorded and the presentation materials will be posted on our website at www.cml.org under training materials. For those of you who are not familiar with the GoToWebinar platform, you should see a control panel to the top right of your screen. There's an orange arrow to the left of the panel, which will minimize the entire box. All of the participants, have been muted for this webinar, but we encourage you to ask questions by typing them into the question box on the control panel. And we will hold a Q&A near the end of the webinar as time permits. So feel free to type the questions as you think of them throughout the presentation. At this time, I would like to hand things over to Lindsay Rogers, who will give us an introduction of our topic, speakers, and agenda.
Great, thanks so much, Courtney, and thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today to talk about 21st century solutions to water and growth challenges in the Front Range. Before we dive in, just go to the next slide here. Just do a very brief introduction to my organization. WaterNow Alliance is a nonprofit network of local water decision makers supporting sustainable, affordable, and climate resilient water solutions in their communities and across the country. And my work as WaterNow's Colorado Basin Program Manager, based in the Denver metro area, focuses on supporting cities and towns and water providers to implement many of the innovative solutions to help close Colorado's municipal supply and demand gap that we're going to be talking about today. Next slide. And I'm very excited to be joined today by our panelists who have a wide range of expertise in advancing innovative multi-benefit water supply and demand strategies. Alex Funk is the Agricultural and Rural Resiliency Policy Specialist at Colorado Water Conservation Board. He works with the agricultural community to further the Colorado Water Plan's agricultural viability goals, including managing the Alternative Transfer Methods program. Before joining CWCB, Alex served as the Western Policy Director with the National Young Farmers Coalition, where he focused on addressing challenges affecting next generation producers, and as a fellow with American Rivers, researching the nexus between irrigated ag and healthy river systems. Brett Bovey is the Regional Director for Westwater Research and leads the Colorado office in Fort Collins. Brett has 17 years of experience conducting a variety of engineering, economic, and water rights studies across the western states. Many of these projects have been focused on water resources management and water development concepts in the pursuit, protection, and utilization of water rights. Since joining Westwater, Brett has performed dozens of focused water right valuation studies and broader economic and water market analyses. Emily Hunt is the Deputy Infrastructure Director for the City of Thornton, where she oversees the city's water supply functions. Highlights of her over 25 years working in Colorado water include studying sediment transport after the 1996 Buffalo Creek fire and multiple successful collaborations with other water providers. Emily had the privilege of participating in Water Education Colorado's first Water Leaders program in 2006. And she serves on the board of directors for the Colorado Water Congress, the Metro Roundtable, and she's currently the vice president of the Colorado Water Trust. And lastly, Christy Wiseman, she, her, hers, is certified with the American Institute of Certified Planners, and she's currently the land use and water planner for the Colorado Department of Local Affairs. As part of this role, she works with CWCB to manage the Colorado Water and Land Use Planning Alliance, a stakeholder group advancing water planning and land use planning integration throughout Colorado. Previously, she was a long-range land use planner for Boulder County, Colorado. She holds a BS in environmental geography and a master's in city and regional planning. Next slide, please. So we're going to begin today's session with a broad overview of Colorado's water supply and demand challenges, including the goals outlined in the state's water plan to address these challenges, and specifically how irrigated ag is currently being impacted and how it will likely be impacted in the future. Then we're going to talk about some innovative options available to municipal water providers to reduce the potential need for more traditional water supply acquisition or buy and dry transfers. Next, we'll talk about the City of Thornton's work to mitigate the impact of a water transfer through smart, community-informed land use planning efforts. And lastly, we'll look at the suite of solutions available to us on the demand management side to encourage water smart growth and development. And with that, I will go ahead and pass it over to Alex Funk to get us started.
Thanks, Lindsay. Excited to be here today. Again, Alex Funk with the Colorado Water Conservation Board. If you're not familiar with the CWCB, we are a state agency within the State Department of Natural Resources and is the state's lead water policy and planning agency. So I think to start, we've got a poll for everyone. I'm going to pull that up now. So I think just to get some, I think that's just some background. I think this question is really just kind of getting at, sort of which of the following do you feel is the biggest challenge to future water supplies in Colorado? And just please select one. You have drought, climate change, lack of storage, population growth, and high per capita water usage.
Numbers are still coming in. I just want to make sure everyone has a chance to vote. Not sure if the results popped up for you. They did not. Great. Awesome. So I'm terribly sorry. I'm going to have to read them. 17% said drought. 13% said climate change. 8% said lack of storage. 50% population growth. And 13% high per capita water usage.
Yeah, really interesting, and we'll cover some of that context, I think, in these following slides. So I'm going to cover sort of a lot of things here in the next few minutes. Hopefully, we still have enough time at the end to get to questions. So I think I was going to talk a little bit about sort of the geographical and sort of hydrologic context of water in the state, and kind of set the framework for sort of how municipalities sort of work with the ag community to address sort of different water supply challenges across the state. So in terms of a high level overview of sort of the hydrology in Colorado, and I think many people have probably heard some of these numbers before, but Colorado is sort of unique in that, sort of 90%, give or take, of our population lives in the eastern part of the state along the Front Range, or sort of the eastern part of the Continental Divide, along with the majority of our ag and food production, major sort of urban centers, and large industrial water uses. But sort of the paradox there is that, the South Platte and Arkansas basins are, both over allocated in terms of supply and demand, whereas 80% or sort of give or take of our water is actually on the western slope of the state, or sort of our wetter but less populated western half. And so one of the sort of key mechanisms that Colorado utilizes to address that sort of imbalance is that there is this fairly sophisticated system of trans-mountain diversion projects that collect water from the Colorado River and headwater system, and then transport that through a system of sort of reservoirs and tunnels to the Front Range. And those really serve as sort of supplemental supply or augmentation supply to different native water uses on the Front Range. So some of the sort of major ones would be the Colorado Big Thompson project in northeastern Colorado, Denver's Lake Dillon, Roberts Tunnel, and Moffett systems, and there are several others as well. Sort of the other challenges that affect sort of water policy and planning in the state is that, Colorado is a semi-arid state. But we also, frequently experience periodic drought, which is, really defined as any sort of temporary period of drier than average conditions due to, either a lack of precipitation or soil moisture. There's almost always drought affecting some portion of Colorado, but I think in recent years, what we're seeing is a pretty large swath of the state being affected at once. So last year, 2020, was actually a little unique in that 100% of the state at one point was covered in some drought conditions. I believe that hadn't happened since 2013. This year, or currently, due to some rain in the northeastern part of the state, we are back at 80% in moderate drought, but 16% in exceptional drought. And sort of what we're seeing, and what this sort of shows us, so we never kind of feel those drought impacts uniformly across the state. And so right now, the western slope is being heavily impacted by drought. So even if we're seeing a lot of rain, if you're in Denver today, or snow, like the rest of the state still is extremely dry, and climate change is being shown to sort of fuel those drought conditions and make those droughts more frequent and more intense. And that's sort of reflected here. So if you have any friend that's a meteorologist, they were really geeking out last week over the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's release of the new climate normals. So these essentially refer to the average sort of temperature and precipitation patterns over a 30-year period, in this case 1991 to 2020. As you can see, at least on the right-hand sort of chart there in terms of temperature, the country as a whole is warming on average over the past 30 years. But if you zero in on Colorado and really the desert Southwest, we're disproportionately warming to a larger extent than other parts of the country. I think the more concerning one is even the precipitation map. So as a whole, as you can kind of see, the country is largely getting wetter for the most part, except for the desert Southwest, California, and our other western states. And even in Colorado, you can kind of see there's some, sort of pockets, like especially on the northeastern portion there, that may be getting a little more precipitation, but the western slope, the southern part of Colorado, has been getting drier. And so that, really kind of puts into question some long-term strategies on how we address water supply issues in the state. One of the most immediate impacts, or sort of long-term trends that will occur as a result of those warmer and drier conditions are reductions in flow. So this is a projection of flows on the Colorado River system, looking at stream flows at Lee Ferry, which is sort of the political dividing point between the upper and lower Colorado River basins. It's downstream directly of Glenwood or Glen Canyon Dam. The key takeaway here is that flows in the Colorado River are projected to decline fairly considerably. I think a different study done by Brad Udall showed that upwards of 35% reduction in flow due to temperature increases could occur on the Colorado River system. And so I think kind of reconnecting this back to that initial slide that showed the disparity in water across the divide, if flows decline on the Colorado River system, that's going to shrink sort of those trans-mountain supplies and availability of those supplies, which is going to put more pressure again on in-basin water development, particularly in the South Platte and Arkansas basins. So the other key driver, and what we heard about in the survey, is that population growth will also affect water use to some extent moving forward as well. Our technical update to the Colorado Water Plan, which I'll talk more about here in a second, found that while overall estimates of population are down somewhat since we, I think, first looked at population and water use back in 2015, we're still looking at upwards of between 8.5 million to 9.2 million, I think, in the hot growth climate scenario there in terms of population growth in the state. And some other key findings that we have found is that so per capita water use has actually declined overall for the most part, but sort of given the climate demands and sort of increases in temperature and the corresponding effect that has on sort of consumptive use, especially for outdoor irrigation, we're still looking at potential water demand gaps or demands increasing 35 to 75% over current baselines under these scenarios. And I'll back up a little bit and talk about what these scenarios mean. So essentially, under the Colorado Water Plan, we have developed 5 different sort of possible futures, ranging from, business as usual to 3 of these scenarios actually incorporate some elements in climate change, including decreases in precipitation and increases in temperature. And so we kind of look at these as all plausible sort of futures, so we kind of get a sense of what our sort of range of sort of gaps and other sort of factors are going to be moving forward. So with that, this chart, also from the technical update, basically shows what the max gaps. So we define that as essentially the difference between available supply and projected demand. That in between is the gap. As part of the water plan and sort of state planning process, we talk a lot about how we close that gap. And we'll hear a lot about those strategies today, so I won't spend a lot of time going over that. But I think the key takeaway from this slide is that, we're going to see obviously the largest M&I gaps in that South Platte sort of metro basin, as well as the Arkansas. So I've mentioned the Colorado Water Plan a few times. I think others will mention it today as well. If you're not familiar with it, this was essentially a state roadmap for how to address different water supply challenges across the state that was released back in 2015. It is the first state water plan. We are actually in the process of updating it. And so it is a living document, and we're constantly kind of including new information about emerging challenges, but it really does serve as our sort of guiding set of principles and objectives in terms of how we're, strategically addressing different water supply or natural resource management issues across the state in a way that sort of reflects that there's a need for water across different economic sectors, including agriculture and municipalities. I'll just quickly mention that in addition to that statewide plan, there are regional plans or basin implementation plans that are developed by each of the major basins in the state, which are listed here. And so there are also regional sort of planning efforts underway to sort of look at some of these issues. The water plan does contain some goals or sort of targets that which we sort of coordinate our funding and other resources towards. The ones that are, I think we'll talk on this about today are listed here. So we've already talked a little bit about kind of closing that supply-demand gap. We're going to talk a little bit about demand management and conservation within the municipal sector and sort of how that can help close some of these gaps. I believe Christy is going to talk a little bit about the land use process, and then Brett and I are going to talk a little bit more about this sort of issue around agricultural productivity and how we're utilizing what we call alternative transfer methods, which we'll define as a means to meet some of these growing demands while keeping agriculture in production. So with that, I'm going to give a whirlwind sort of 101 on why the state works on this issue called basically alternative transfer methods, and sort of how we work with urban and agricultural partners and other stakeholders to address some of these growing concerns around gaps without necessarily drying up agriculture on a significant scale to the detriment, long-term detriment of some of these agricultural communities. So just by way of background, sort of the importance of irrigated agriculture in Colorado, it is a significant sort of critical driver to the state's overall economy. Particularly in more rural areas, agriculture does remain sort of a key economic backbone. So not only does it employ farmers and ranchers, but it employs equipment dealers and sort of other inputs into those operations. And so a lot of regions like the Rio Grande and Eastern Colorado are still really reliant on agriculture. There are also, these working landscapes provide a number of other public benefits ranging from wildlife habitat to sort of flood mitigation. And generally the public in Colorado is very supportive of protecting agricultural land and water space and water for open space preservation and maintaining these working lands in the future. So why is this a challenge when it comes to water? So largely the concern, what you'll hear is sort of this colloquial term of buying dry. And so basically what buy and dry is essentially a process in which water is sold off of an irrigated sort of agricultural operation to another use on a permanent basis. And while that is a legal process under Colorado water law, it is a very valuable tool. It is a voluntary transaction. It does result in third-party impacts that can sort of ripple throughout the communities where that water originated. So the sort of poster child of this is Crowley County, Colorado. This is in southeastern Colorado along the main stem of the Arkansas River. Due to a number of sort of issues, mainly depressed economic value for crops and drought in the 1960s and 70s, there was a sort of a process in which several key sort of irrigated ag water rights were sold to different developers in this period of time on a fairly large scale. And that resulted in a roughly 92% reduction in irrigated acreage in Crowley County alone. That eventually led to some significant loss of jobs and populations generally, a decline in the local tax base that was generated from those farming operations. And now the economy of that county is completely different and much smaller. So again, when we talk about sort of buy and dry, we are really kind of, as a state perspective, we are really concerned about these third party or sort of like socioeconomic impacts that may result from those transfers if they're not done in a way that looks to mitigate or address some of those community concerns. And this is just another sort of kind of zooming back up to the northeastern part of the state, kind of showing that, again, over time, we are seeing urbanization and other trends sort of affecting irrigated acreage in the state. Now, not all of this land loss is associated with that buy and dry practice that I'm just talking about, but I think this is, again, more just highlighting that. We are seeing an overall decline in irrigated acreage in the state due to development and other urban pressures. And these are just putting some numbers to, again, what we've talked about and kind of just highlighting that, water resource development does have a pretty significant effect on land use. I'll just point out too, again, these are all numbers that came out of our technical update. We're looking at somewhere between upwards of 77,000 acres coming out of production, due to that ag to urban transfer process. Even more due to urbanization and just development generally. And then not so much important for today, but another key driver of irrigated land loss in the state is basically just groundwater sustainability issues and declining aquifer availability and augmentation supplies across the state. So we're going to talk about a lot of, I think, different tools that sort of get to how we address some of those externalities and impacts. But one of the tools that we, as the state, sort of work with different partners to support are what we call alternative transfer methods or water sharing agreements. And in a nutshell, we've talked about that sort of traditional, sort of permanent water transaction process. ATMs or these sharing agreements are really designed to essentially just be alternatives to that approach. So they sort of operate under sort of similar mechanisms, but are typically done so more on a temporary nature, and ownership is retained in part by the ag, sort of in theory, or to some extent by the ag producer. So the water staying in ag, being leased out on a temporary basis. These are just some of the basic components to an ATM. Again, traditionally, they have largely been, there's an ag water user involved. There's typically some interested purchaser of that water. There's a legal transfer mechanism to approve that process, and all the other sort of necessary infrastructure and components to deliver that water to its new use. Again, this is kind of tough to read, but this is sort of just, again, showing some of those necessary conditions for an ATM project. The key ones here being you need a sort of willing buyer and seller relationship. You need that infrastructure to actually deliver that conserved water to the new use, including storage. You need funding in place to make these deals happen. And then I would also say you need a combination of sort of financial and public incentives, dry conditions, legal requirements, and really just knowledgeable and dedicated utility staff. These are really complex arrangements, and sort of having dedicated and staff that are open to these creative sort of water leasing and sharing opportunities is a huge part of making these projects work. Briefly, again, the mechanics of this, sort of how these work. There's sort of two pieces to every ATM. There's sort of the conserved consumptive use or source of water. So there has to be some sort of process in which you're reducing consumptive use through some measure such as like temporary fallowing, which is essentially just not irrigating for a piece of portion of time. You know, sort of maybe switching to lower use crops or using deficit irrigation, which is sort of the strategic application of irrigation water at certain growth periods. All those generate what we call consumptive use savings, and those are legally transferable in Colorado. And then that water is shepherded to its new use through some structure such as a lease or water bank or some other legal mechanism. The benefits of this approach, I know I'm running it over, so I'll just highlight a few. I think the ones that we're seeing the most promise in are really that, you know, compared to more traditional transfers, ATMs really do provide some opportunities to preserve open space and sort of maintain working landscapes. So you can actually couple these water leasing arrangements, for example, with conservation easements. And we actually have a number of land trusts that are really active in this space. And so, again, it depends on the details of each arrangement, but you can design these in a way to help sort of maintain some buffers and sort of working ag lands, as well as sort of utilizing some creative water sharing techniques. I think most of these pieces of information on those last few slides came out of the WaterNow Alliance report on ATMs. And this is that link, and I think we can probably share that in the chat if you're interested in more about that report. I will say moving forward, and Brett will talk more about this, but we did come out with a sort of a status report update last year on sort of how, you know, the state is making progress on some of these water sharing issues. Again, I won't go through all of these other than say that there's still a lot of work to be done here. But, you know, we still see a lot of value in these ATM sort of water sharing opportunities as a model for how, you know, sort of municipal and ag sector can kind of work together to address different water resource issues. And we're hoping to kind of continue making sort of these types of projects a priority as part of our water plan update and programming moving forward. And so I think with that, I'm handing the baton off to Brett, I believe. You can talk a little bit more about this slide, or maybe you can kind of go back there, Brett. I know I was kind of going over a little bit.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think I'm going to pick up where Alex left off with talking about innovative water supply solutions. And in Colorado, we've come up with the term alternative water transfers or alternative transfer methods, or ATMs, to basically be a term to represent these sort of new, innovative types of water supply solutions. Let's see, do I have control of the slide? Let me see. Sorry.
Oh, no, you're okay. You do have control. I did take it just now to unmute myself, but just click on it. I'm sorry, once I mute myself, just click on it.
Okay. There we go. Thank you. So I'm going to cover two topics, and really these two things are coming out of the, a status report on ATMs that was done and released last July. The status report covers a number of things such as historical background, where we are, sort of a status update on how state efforts to develop these innovative water supply solutions, how they're going, and also a lot of discussion around, well, what else can be done, and what else can be done on ATMs, and what else can be done besides ATMs to really advance some policy objectives of the state. And I will say this term ATMs is used a lot, and something that Alex said rang true to me, which is that these aren't off-the-shelf things, as in when a community or a group of water users develops an ATM in one place, there are concepts that are transferable, but they're very far from an off-the-shelf type of water supply product or solution. They're very localized and customized. So the two topics I'm going to be talking about today are how to improve the use of ATMs. So the state's invested for ATMs for a pretty long time now, and so there's continued ideas on how to advance the use of these and consideration of these tools. So that'll be the first thing I touch upon, and then the second thing will be what other actions besides ATMs can communities do to really target the underlying reason that the state has policy objectives, which is focused on preservation of agricultural production and agricultural landscapes, and reducing the permanent dry up of agricultural lands. So first topic is how to improve use of ATMs. And one thing just to note, sort of to set this off, is why does the state have to put so much energy towards developing new water supply solutions in the form of ATMs or alternatives to what's typically done? And the reason is because there are a lot of barriers that stand in the way between communities just doing this on their own voluntarily and getting a successful water supply project off the ground. What I say here is they're not an obvious choice, and that's true. Municipal communities, they like to own water rights. They like to own them permanently. They like to have, in a sense, complete control over that water supply. And an ATM, which I'll broadly define as a water agreement where water is not permanently transferred from a source use, such as agriculture, to a new use, it inherently involves some amount of agreement and cooperation between parties. And historically, the municipal sector has liked to own and have complete control over water supply assets, water rights. And so there's several barriers that have come up in our status report update. We surveyed municipal water managers, we surveyed the basin roundtables, which are sort of water stakeholders around the state, and even past participants who've done ATM projects. We phone interviewed them about what are some of the barriers to seeing more use of ATM type water supply agreements. And as you see in these charts, which have small writing, but I'll just kind of briefly touch upon them. As you see, there are a lot of barriers that come up when people think about the obstacles to developing and utilizing these alternatives for water supply. And just to reiterate, they are alternatives to permanently acquiring water rights and subsequently, or at the same time, drying up the farmland associated with those water rights. That is the status quo, and these ATMs are alternatives to that process. And what's listed here are barriers, regulatory barriers, cost barriers, and financial barriers, and in a large part, comfort barriers on the side of both parties. So with those barriers in mind, we took a look at, well, how could we improve the use of ATMs? And this is mainly from the perspective of the state, the CWCB as a state agency. So it doesn't necessarily touch upon the municipal perspective or the agricultural perspective. It's really how can the state, through the tools available to it, promote and improve the use of these. So these are the 5 points we came up with. Maintain the grant program. So CWCB has long had a grant program in place to provide funding for parties to sort of get the project off the ground is the easiest way to put it. And to date, they've provided roughly $7 million in grant funding over, I think this grant program started around 2007, to various research projects and sort of seed funding to get projects off the ground. And that grant program I think it remains critical to getting progress on ATMs in Colorado because it provides that initial block of funding to study it and to get the wheels going. Second thing is incentivize ATM consideration. So grant funding policies or CWSB loans could be structured to sort of incentivize ATMs if they're a piece of the project. So perhaps lower interest rates, perhaps more relaxed grant funding opportunities to sort of incentivize the ATMs as a piece of the planning studies. Reducing regulatory uncertainty. One of the things that came up that has been adopted in some places is rather than revisiting the engineering around the water transfers, is really just to adopt some agreed upon, I'll call them presumptive factors that allow you to run through that regulatory process faster and with less argument and objection. You know, it would take some work to get these factors in place, but the idea is if there was agreement that this is the water supply yield from this property or this type of property, that you don't have to spend as much time in that regulatory process to get the water transfer completed. Some water users around Colorado wanted more coordination between the Colorado Water Conservation Board and the Colorado Department of Water Resources on how to look at ATMs and annual water supply agreements. And then finally, education, just more of what we're doing today, just educating people that this is something that they could look at as part of their water supply planning and land use planning as well. So, oops, I'll go back. Is there any way to go back? Can you go back one slide? Oh, there we go. So now I'm going to run into the second section of what I'm going to talk about, which is, well, what else besides ATMs? So ATMs are an idea where a new water need, it's often a municipal water need in Colorado. You know, how can they use alternative ways of securing water supplies instead of permanently acquiring the water rights and associated dry up of the farmland? And one thing to look at would be sort of what I would call the Boulder County example of, well, don't look at it from a water perspective, just look at it as a land perspective. If the underlying objective is not to dry up farmland, then find a land-based way to not dry up farmland. And really Boulder County, you know, had many years of acquiring farmland and putting conservation easements on them and sort of having big scale planning on how to maintain buffers between communities. And so that could be an alternative is take the land-based view of buffering between communities, conservation easements on farm properties, and sort of take the land view to that underlying objective instead of the water view. Another thing that could be looked at is changing or modifying municipal water dedication policies. So really, the underlying basis on why water supply is acquired and why farmland is dried up is when development happens. And development, when it happens, there's a policy in place that says if you're going to build this many homes, you need to dedicate a certain volume of water rights or a certain amount of cash that will then be used to go buy water rights to support that development. And basically, the idea is growth pays its own way, that a municipality is not going to use its existing water supply portfolio to serve new demands without some compensation or some amount of new either cash or water dedication to the municipality. And so one thing that could be changed on the margin is just, well, what does that policy look like? I mean, we have had success in municipal water conservation over the years. And so with that success, you would expect to see that new development should be dedicating less water than a development 20 years ago. So communities are doing this, and I would just, you know, encourage that to continue, that since we've seen municipal water conservation, new development should be dedicating a little bit less water when they want to build. oops, let me go back. One more slide. The third thing as an alternative to ATMs is the idea of municipalities owning the water rights, but leasing them back to agriculture. And this is done across the Front Range. I think our inventory showed close to 100,000 acre feet of water is annually leased back to agriculture from municipalities. And the more that municipalities can make that lease sort of multi-year and more certain for the ag sector, I think it opens up some better opportunities for agriculture in terms of being able to invest in a property and know that the water is going to be there, as opposed to just annually checking in on whether the water is there under a lease from the cities. So making those leases long-term and more certain, I think, could be a benefit to agriculture that is separate and distinct from ATMs. So that's it. Hopefully that was helpful and informative on sort of where we are in ATMs and what could be done moving forward. So thanks.
Thanks, Brett. I think I'm next. This is Emily Hunt. Can everybody hear me? And I think I've got control. Maybe? I do. Oops, too much control. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here, to be on this panel with this group of folks that I always learn so much from. So I'm not so sure how familiar this crowd is with Thornton's Northern Project, so I'll take a couple of minutes to just get you oriented. This map is the area that encompasses the Thornton Northern Project. You can see the Cache la Poudre River. I'll try to use my cursor here, coming down from the Callion mouth, kind of through the city of Fort Collins until it leaves the map at the bottom of the page. This dark blue line up here is the Larimer County Canal, which is the main ditch of the Water Supply and Storage Company system. These green polygons that you see out here, these are the farms that Thornton purchased as part of our Northern Project, and we actually still own most of these farms. We continue the irrigated agriculture on these farms by cash leasing to local farmers. About 20 years ago, we did start the gradual conversion of about a third of these farms away from irrigated ag to native and other self-sustaining grasses. We have an active agricultural stewardship office in Alt, which is right here. We've got 3 Thornton staff members up there whose sole responsibility is to steward these properties, to work with the farmers and vendors and contractors that we use up there, as well as with the local community. And then the city of Thornton is located about 50 miles to the south off of this map. So in my mind, Thornton's Northern Project represents kind of a pretty traditional buy and dry. Here's a timeline you can see. We made the acquisition in the 1980s. We spent a good 12 years in water court, and our decree really did end up setting the standard for a lot of the agricultural to municipal transfers for years to come. So fast forward to 2014, and we started in earnest to design the infrastructure necessary to move this water from the WISC system roughly 70 miles southeast to the city of Thornton. This infrastructure pipeline project we call the Thornton Water Project. And then in 2018, we began what we're talking about today, kind of in earnest, which is the Thornton Northern Property Stewardship Plan. It's delayed, sorry. There we go. So I really see Thornton's Northern Project as a whole as having 3 legs. It's kind of like 3 legs of a stool. The first is our Northern Project Water Court Decree. This is obviously the legally binding document that addresses water rights injury. It addresses our requirements to revegetate the properties, and it's really designed to ensure that the water users on the Poudre River, as well as the other shareholders in the Water Supply and Storage Company system, aren't injured due to Thornton's transfer. The second leg is the Thornton Water Project, and as I mentioned, this is the pipeline to deliver that water. This involves the local regulatory processes that govern these sorts of construction projects. And finally, this last leg is the Thornton Northern Property Stewardship Plan, and this is a voluntary effort that Thornton began about 4 years ago. The stewardship plan really came out of a need that Thornton identified as we've been making land use decisions in the area for over 30 years. And as we look to the future land use decisions that we need to be making, it became really obvious early on that Thornton is a pretty significant presence, not just in the WISC system, but in the communities that have sprung up around the WISC system, all the way from Fort Collins to Alt and Eaton. We are a part of these communities, and sometimes we've been viewed as not very welcome members of the community. So we've seen over the past 30 years the changes and the pressures that these communities are facing for a lot of different reasons, from growth to changes in the ag industry, all sorts of things. And we hear from the communities that they've got some angst around what it is that Thornton is planning to do in the area. And there's a lot of energy around that, and there's some animosity and some fear. And so we decided that there has to be a way to essentially take what the communities are viewing as control and restriction that the Thornton ownership of these properties has on their ability to adjust and adapt to the changes that they are facing, and to shift that away so that Thornton's presence is really more of a stabilizing influence. Could our presence actually galvanize something good for the region? You know, is there a way that our consistency and our practices and our presence up there could actually help communities transition while still meeting the needs of Thornton's water ratepayers? There was also some motivation for Thornton here too, for sure. You know, we're making decisions about what to do with irrigated property. We're getting solicitations from interested parties about buying our properties. We're getting farmers who lease from us who want to know if they should invest in a center pivot. And we found that we were not well enough informed to make these kinds of decisions. We didn't have the right information. We were a bit overwhelmed with this kind of cascading effect that a decision on a single piece of land may have on our entire asset. So we really needed a more robust way to evaluate what some of the future decisions around these properties needed to be. So we took a pause and we went to about 60,000 feet. We collected some publicly available data. We conducted some one-on-one interviews with people who know the region and its challenges. Probably the biggest thing we heard from the folks we discussed this with was that, you know, agricultural heritage is obviously very important in the region. The second thing we heard is that there's a real interest to diversify the economies up here so that they're not so vulnerable. And we also heard that there's a real interest and need in kind of a more regional approach to land use planning and water use planning. And there's not really a clear way of going about how to do that. So we identified two specific projects we wanted to embark on. The first is a regional land use assessment that's going to identify potential future land uses on Thornton properties by exploring the local land use context. This entails reviewing local land use plans, engaging community members in discussions pertaining to the future needs of the cities and towns and the residents of the area, and determining prospective optimal land uses in areas where Thornton acquired its farms. The second is a water optimization study, which is going to explore how this kind of continued irrigation provision that we have in our water court decree could potentially help farmers, conservation groups, and other parties restore irrigation on prime farmlands that are poised to be dried up. We're super grateful to the Colorado Water Conservation Board, who has provided grant funding for these projects, and we're also pursuing additional grants, which when combined with the CWCB funds and Thornton's own contribution will allow us to move forward with these projects. So since you're all stakeholders of sorts, I did want to spend a couple of minutes just digging into some of the initial data that we've collected. I'm hoping your brains will start turning and you'll be eager to contact me and our team after this to tell me you have some insights. So this first map shows Thornton's farms outlined in black. And what you see in the dark gray area are the municipal boundaries in the regions, and the lightly shaded gray areas represent growth management areas of those regions. So you see that 64% of the WISC system lies in somebody's growth management area. And what you can see from this map is that there are certain Thornton properties that are probably very well suited for development, residential development. There are other properties that might support commercial or industrial development. So you can just really start to see how this region and the WISC system in general is feeling some very significant growth pressure. This next slide is showing that same WISC system, again, Thornton properties outlined in black, and there's a soil classification layer overlaid on this map. The green areas indicate areas of prime farmland with class 1 and 2 soils. The other classifications that are represented in red are not prime. Maybe they don't have great soils, maybe they've got drainage issues. And so you can start to see that there are some properties that Thornton owns and in the region that possibly should stay in irrigated ag. These are areas that we might decide to make agricultural preservation areas. And then this slide, oh, it's taking some time to load. Oh, I guess I had it animated. This slide shows conservation opportunities around the Thornton properties. So it's a composite analysis that shows protected lands, potential conservation areas. One question that we might pose to our stakeholders as we're beginning more of this outreach is there some interest in some large-scale conservation to support land use protection? Or maybe there's some smaller scale conservation to create some connectivity or to deliver green infrastructure. For example, the arrows on this map are drainages that might be able to serve some stormwater functions for the surrounding communities. So then this next map is similar to a map that Alex showed, and it's kind of zooming out a little bit more. So you're seeing the Denver area all the way up north to the Colorado-Wyoming state line, and it's essentially a map of the major ditch systems in the region. The labels I know are hard to read, but you've got the Wisk system, the North Poudre system, Greeley, Loveland, Platte Valley, Frico Bar, Henryland. And what you see in red is the dry up acreage now that has already been dried up. It doesn't account for properties like Thornton's, which are scheduled for dry up, but that haven't undergone that transition. And some of the initial takeaways from this data is that the Wisk system and really all of these systems are going to become increasingly fragmented as the growth pressures in the region continue. And the ditch companies are going to continue to face water delivery challenges, and the irrigators are going to continue to experience water shortages. So for me, this really drives home how important that third leg of the stool is, right? Alex kind of mentioned that there are some third-party consequences that don't necessarily get taken into account in water court decrees or in regulatory processes. And so when you have these large-scale ag to municipal transfers, you've got water court protecting water rights, regulatory processes, managing some land use impacts, but the impact of the region is a real challenge. And the impact that one entity can have on a region can be big in a negative way, for sure, as kind of the Crowley County example shows us. But our hope is that by undergoing this sort of voluntary and community-driven process, such as our Northern Property Stewardship Plan, that our impact can be big in another way, and that it can actually help create some positive outcomes around some of the challenges that the region is facing. So that really concludes my presentation. I'm super excited about this project and process, and I just want to thank the folks that we've talked to over the past couple of years as we've tried to create kind of a container to tackle this. So I think I'm handing it over to Christy next. Thanks.
Thanks, Emily. So I'm the anchor leg of our relay here, so I'll try to be speedy. I'm Christy Wiseman. I work at DOLA as the Land Use and Water Planner in the Community Development Office. And I'm going to be talking about the demand side, kind of the land use side of things, and how there are lots of different strategies your communities can consider to address any water supply gaps that you have. So Alex did a great job covering water supply challenges and particularly how climate is making things difficult for water supply managers. I do want to note one thing on this slide at the bottom on the land use front, which is the cost and controversy of new and expanded storage projects. So this is Gross Reservoir in Boulder County. And really when we think about how we're addressing gaps, there's so much to be gained on the demand side management of things, and that's what I'm going to focus on. So when it comes to water demand challenges, it really lies at the crux of an issue, which is that water providers don't have land use planning jurisdiction over the areas that they serve. And there's often a lack of communication and coordinated planning between those water providers and the land use authority that actually has permitting power in the jurisdiction. And they are traditionally very siloed, and a lot of the work I do is getting communities to start bringing together the land use planners and the water supply planners. So everyone knows in Colorado we're growing, and the way we grow matters. By 2050, it's projected that our population might nearly double. And what's important about that is that by 2050, most people will live in buildings that are yet to be built. So the potential conservation gains of all this new development, if we build it right and with water conservation in mind, is huge. And it's really going to be critical that communities develop in a more land use style that's more water efficient than what we've seen in the previous kind of 5 million people. And it all comes down to needing land use strategies so that Colorado can continue to grow and thrive in the way that their communities want to, but with water scarcity in mind. So here's a visual depiction of the water land use nexus. As I said, they're traditionally kind of siloed disciplines. So on the land use side, we have things like planned unit development, subdivision and zoning ordinances, annexation, comprehensive planning, site plan regulations, building and plumbing codes. And on the water provider side, we have incentive and rebate programs, outdoor water use restrictions, rates and tap fees, water efficiency plans, which are required for any water provider that sells more than 2,000 acre feet per year. And we're really working to bring these two pieces together through planning integration, as well as, education, coordination, and communication between these two entities. So the good news about municipal demand management is that there's a suite of tools that your communities can use. And really you can pick and choose based on what works for you. So you can see a chart here that really at every stage in the development process, from long-range planning and comprehensive planning all the way through your development review process to even post-occupancy programs, there are ways to tie in water conservation in really every step. And this screenshot here comes from a great guidebook that's free. It's from the Sonoran Institute. I highly recommend it, and it's a nice 25-inch page guide to all of these potential strategies you can use to integrate water into your land use planning process. So I want to focus in on comprehensive planning really quickly. That's why I have that highlighted, just because there was legislation passed last year about water and comprehensive plans. So this is House Bill 20-1095, and this does not require communities to incorporate water into their comprehensive plans. It's not a mandate, it's an if-then. So it's basically saying that if your community chooses to incorporate water into your comprehensive plan, then at minimum you have to do a few things. So you have to consult with the entities that provide water to your jurisdiction, whether that's a water provider within the municipal kind of structure. So maybe you have a municipal utility, or it could be private water providers or larger regional water providers. You have to identify your water supplies and facilities for long-term planning, and you have to include water conservation policies, ideally tied to the Colorado Water Plan. And these water policies can be implemented into, again, all stages of the land use process, from development approvals, your subdivision regulations, planned unit developments, special use permitting, zoning. And importantly, at the bottom there, this bill appropriated a full-time position within DOLA to provide technical assistance to communities on this topic, and that is me. So I'm here as a resource for you going forward. So really quickly, this is just a snapshot saying that there's been a lot of energy around water and land use integration in the state for over 10 years, and CWCB and DOLA have had a formal partnership on this topic since 2015, which is, as Alex said, when the first water plan came out. And in 2017, CWCB and DOLA came together to form this stakeholder group called the Colorado Water and Land Use Planning Alliance. This is a voluntary, non-formal group made of lots of different organizations that you can see here, from state agencies, local governments, universities, NGOs. And we meet once a quarter to really talk about what communities are doing related to this topic, what help they need, how are we going to compile technical assistance and funding resources. In the past, the Alliance has worked to put together webinars, training modules, guidance documents. There's grant funding available. basically, it's a great resource, and I'm happy to get you connected in with that network if you'd like. And it's also great to have that peer exchange with other local governments, both staff and elected officials who participate in that group. So really quickly, a couple municipal project examples of Colorado communities that have recently done work on water and land use. City of Fort Collins, City of Golden, Severance, and Evans. The purpose of this slide is to say that you are not alone. If your city is starting to think that addressing your water supply challenges on the land use side is something you want to more seriously consider, there are lots of examples in communities that are already doing these things that you can reach out to. And in general, people are very happy to help and kind of share resources. So this is the money slide. Everyone likes that. So state funding for water and land use planning. The big pot within DOLA is our EIAF fund, and that is the largest funder of comprehensive plans in the state. We also fund water and land use integration projects, water infrastructure projects. There's kind of two buckets. We have administrative planning grants, which are smaller awards. Those are accepted on a rolling basis. Then we also have a larger biannual EIF fund cycle. Tier 1 grants are for planning processes, awards up to $200,000. And the next application period for this EIF round opens in August, early August, and will close in early September. So any questions on DOLA grants, contact your DOLA regional manager and they can get you started on that process. Also, the Colorado Water Conservation Board has grants and you can reach out to the relevant staff for those. And then lastly, if you're interested in diving more into this topic, feel free to contact me and I can get you plugged into the Colorado Water and Land Use Planning Alliance. The next meeting is in July. And I'm happy to talk further about what strategies your community is interested in doing on the land use planning front. And then lastly, if you have questions about infrastructure projects, so this is water treatment plants, drinking water, wastewater. We do have a program manager for that in DOLA. His name is Desi. She's kind of the DOLA liaison for the state revolving fund and her contact is there. So that is it for me.
Thanks so much, Christy, and thank you to all of today's presenters. I know we've covered a lot of different strategies and topics today, and in the interest of wrapping up on time, I'm going to ask all of our presenters to enter your contact details into the chat so that our attendees can follow up with you directly if they have any questions or want to learn more. I know we've been dropping resources as we've been going along into the chat as well, so feel free to take a look there. And next slide, please. So next up, we hope that you'll all tune in on Thursday for part 2 of this webinar series where we'll hear from cities and their nonprofit partners about case studies of those that have engaged in alternative transfer methods or are planning to engage in them in the future. So we'll hear from folks on the ground. I want to thank our presenters again for participating today and for all of this great information. Our attendees for joining us, and of course, the Colorado Municipal League for hosting this webinar. And finally, we would appreciate it if you could take just a minute or two to complete our post-webinar evaluation. And I believe Courtney will be sharing that with you through the webinar portal. So thank you so much. And I hope you all have a great afternoon.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you to our presenters for sharing all of this valuable information with us, and thank you all of you to our attendees for taking the time out of your schedule to join us today. And I know I'm repeating a lot of what Lindsay just said, so I do apologize. I just wanted to quickly remind everyone that our presentation materials will be posted to the CML website by the end of the day, and will also be sent out in a follow-up, which will be sent, you'll have a follow-up survey, and you'll also have a follow-up that will link to the materials, so apologies there. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. With that, I'm going to end the webinar. Thank you for sticking a little late and have a great day, everyone.